Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Mishnah Yomit, Mishnah in depth Bava Batra with Rabbi Nathaniel Helfgot, as part of the Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division at Drisha. And yeah, thank you again for being a part of our learning community and being here. And happy learning. And thank you, Rabbi Helfgot. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Chaya. And yes, if you could put on the sources, that'd be great. So we can go back and look. Um, and I also just wanted to mention, I should have mentioned last week, um, I knew Rifka Rosenwein, and I do want to mention, since the learning of Mishnayot is in her memory, and and her husband, who Baruch Hashem is still alive. Wonderful, wonderful people, and just it should be an Ilui Neshama for everything. Okay, Chaya put on the source sheets again, and let me see if I can. Let me see if I can share. I want to go back for a second to um, to the third Mishnah in the first chapter. Even though you guys are already, if I'm not mistaken, in Mishnah Yomit, you're already up to the third chapter in Mishnah Yomit. Am I correct? You're in the middle of the third chapter. I want to go back because again, I want to highlight a glaring question that emerges, and again, it gets to the heart of what I tried to articulate last week in terms of the differences between Baba Kama and Baba Batra, between what you learned a number of weeks, months ago, and Masechet Baba Batra, certainly the first part of Masechet Baba Batra, which we tried to prove last week, really began at the end of Masechet Bava Metzia, Hilchot Shchenim v'Shutafut, the laws related to neighbors and partners, which kind of bleed from the end of Bava Metzia into the first part of Bava Batra. Certainly the first part, the first three chapters of Bava Batra. But I wanted to go back to this interesting Mishnah here. This Mishnah, which in some manuscripts it's Mishnah Gimel, in some manuscripts it's Mishnah Dalit. So it's a very interesting Mishnah. It says Hamakifet Chaveiro Mishalosh Ruchatav. Okay, so imagine you have concentric. You have a farm inside, a small farm, and you have a bigger farm, and around it, surrounding it, and the person who surrounds the bigger farm sets up a series of gates, of walls, of fences that end up protecting the on three sides, all end up protecting the person who's the inside farm. Nothing that he did. So that's the makif. The makif is the person the outside, and the nikaf in Hebrew is the person who's been protected or who's been surrounded. So the Mishnah says, "Hamakif et chaveiro mishalosh ruchatav." If you surround the inner farm from three sides, gadaret harishona v'tashniya v'tashlishit ein mechayvin oto. If he only set up fences that protect and, so to speak, close any entree that could be deleterious to the inside farm on three directions, ein mechayvin oto. So the person who's inside does not have any obligation to pay the other fellow, because look, the bottom line is he did it for himself. It was his choice. That's fine. Rabbi Yossi Omer, but Rabbi Yossi adds, Im amad v'gadar et haravi'it. If at some point probably the simple reading is the makif. If the makif went and finished and now enclosed the whole thing, megalgelin alav et hakol. Then at this point, the inner farm is totally protected on all four sides, and he now is protected, and he now has an obligation to pay his share for all megalgalim alav et hakol, not just for that last fourth wall enclosure, but he now has an obligation to pay a share in all four directions, all four walls, all four fences that have been put up. So when you read this Mishnah, you say, oh, it makes sense. On the other hand, it doesn't make sense. Why doesn't it make sense? We have a general principle that many of you may have studied when you studied Baba Kama called Ze Nehene V'Ze Lo Chaser. It's a principle that if in general, if I did not benefit, if I benefit something, but you didn't lose anything, you were going to put up that structure anyway. You decided to enclose your property on four directions, and it ended up also protecting my property. So why do I have to pay? I don't have to pay. That's a principle in Baba Kama, all over Baba Kama. This one is getting benefit. But it's not like, it's not like I lost anything. Okay? The classic example for me is, you put in a quarter when it used to cost a quarter to, a parking meter, or 50 cents in a parking meter for half an hour. You only had to be there for 20 minutes. You left, and some other car comes in and enjoys the last 10 minutes of what you put in. Does he have an obligation to pay you? No. Meaning you already paid the 25 cents. You weren't going to get them back. You're not losing anything. So no one expects you, the person who stayed the last 10 minutes, to somehow track down the other car and pay him. So how come here it's different? So again, this is indicative of the fact that the whole principle of Zen Nenev Zelo Chaser is when we're dealing with two strangers, two people who by chance meet up in the public domain, two people who by chance interact with each other. But here we're dealing with shchenim. We're dealing with people who live cheek by jowl next to each other. And out of that reality, a kind of unwritten responsibilities. If somebody does such a great favor for you that you end up being protected, it's not like two strangers. There's a whole kind of Hilchot Shchenim, which exists in its own realm, that demands certain hitchayvuyot, certain responsibilities and obligations that you have to then pay back, irrelevant and, so to speak, parallel to the regular laws of Nezikin, the regular laws of damages or use between two unrelated strangers. Shchenut, neighbor one next to the other, creates a sort of chovot, certain responsibilities, obligations that go beyond the normal categories that we normally associate with. So I just wanted to highlight that because that gets at the core of this entire yichidah, this entire unit, which deals with the laws of shchenim and shchenut and shutafim and all has to do with this kind of different model of interaction that is not relevant to Baba Kama, which leads us to chapter 2. So if we look at chapter 2, and that's what I want to focus my attention on tonight, chapter 2, and then at the end, talk a little bit about chapter 3, and we'll do more about chapter 3 next week as well, chapter 3 and chapter 4. Okay. So chapter 2 also introduces an entire new dimension which doesn't exist in Baba Kama, and that is the dimension of what we would call preventative actions. Baba Kama deals with what is the totsa'ah, what are the consequences if something has happened. My car rammed into your car. My this ran into this. My this broke this. Okay? My shore, my bull, my ram, gored your property, gored your person, gored your this, gored your property, gored your animal. So we're always dealing post facto. We are not dealing with the responsibilities to prevent Nezikin. That does not appear in Baba Kama. Here, again, Now, again, it's probably rooted in the same thing. Obviously, a person is not supposed to be irresponsible, but here we are dealing with when two people are next to each other, when they're in some sort of relationship, even though it's not contractual, and even though it's not familial, and even though it hasn't been spelled out in writing, the very fact that you live cheek by jowl next to somebody else imposes, when it comes to kind of essential actions, essential needs, there's a sort of unwritten and written kind of obligations, mutual obligations between the two parties, which leads to a whole new category called harchakat nizikin. Harchakat nizikin, the category of making sure, to the best of your ability, that what you do in your space doesn't necessarily in any way, when it comes to an essential thing, doesn't harm the other person. And here, of course, we have a foundational tension. We have a foundational tension in any society, which is, what do you do? Okay, what do you do, or how do you balance the needs of each one of the members of the shchenim, of the neighbors? Because on the one hand, you can take a very laissez-faire approach and basically say that you know we want to give the greatest room for autonomy for each person in their space, even if potentially it might harm the neighbor. Now, obviously, there are limits to that according to everybody, right? No one would say in their right mind that I can, take out an AK, 43, whatever, AK, what is it, 14, whatever it's called, and start shooting in my, in my backyard without any concern about where the bullets are going to end up in your backyard and hit somebody, a stray bullet. That's too far. But on the other hand, where do you draw the line about the other thing? So one tfisa, one, so to speak, default position would say, short of something which is so dangerous and so harmful and so, for sure that it's going to harm other people in your neighbors. Other than that, you can do whatever you want in your own space. Betoch shalo, as we say in halacha. You can do whatever you want in your own space. And we don't really care, even if there's a potential that it might harm someone else. Again, certain things we know they're going to harm. Aish, fire. But if we're not dealing with that, we give you the maximum latitude. The other approach, the mirror image approach, would say, no. That you should start from a sense of responsibility to your neighbor. You've created a relationship. You live next to each other by definition, and that should be your starting point. And your starting point should be, I'm not going to do anything that has a potential to impact on my neighbor's space, my neighbor's enjoyment of life, my neighbor's, ability to enjoy his space. And only if I'm 100% sure that that's not going to happen, then I'm allowed to do what I can do in my space. These are two very, so to speak, extreme positions. And they are reflected, so to speak, in this Mishnah here. Take a look in the Mishnah Yud, where you have a foundational machloket, and there's a debate amongst the Rishonim whether this debate is just an example, and really they debate everything in this parak, which we're going to look at, or they only debate this specific case. So the Mishnah says, Marchikim et misra min hayarek. You have to make sure that you are marchik, that you make sure to distance, laharchik. You have to distance your misra. Mishra or Mishra, whatever you want to call it. Mishra, I don't know how they pronounce it here. Yeah. HaMishra. Marchikin et HaMishra min hayerek u'min hakreshim. So you have here some sort of Mishra. Mishra is where you are probably preparing flax, and you are, you're whatchamacallit, you're putting it in water, you're soaking. It's a soaking area. And some of the water may spill out. So you have to make sure, marchikim et hamishra min hayerek u'min hakrashim u'min habitzalim v'tachardal min hadvorim. So Tanakama says you have to be careful to make sure that there's, even though you're doing it in your own backyard, in your own chatzer, in your own courtyard, you have to make sure that you push back your soaking, area for the flax, that it should not be close enough to your friend, to your neighbor's yerek, to his, vegetable garden, to the krashim and the bitzalim, different kinds of vegetables. Vetachardal, and on the other hand, the other neighbor has to, make sure that, that you have to make sure that the chardal, you have to make sure that the chardal mina dvorim. You have to make sure that you plant your mustard seeds away from the chardal. So to speak, what's going to happen? What's going to happen is that the dvorim, the bees, are going to get very attracted to the mustard seeds, and the bees are going to come and they're going to eat from the mustard seeds. And what's going to happen is that the bees are going to get sick and not produce good honey, whatever it's going to be. Rabbi Yossi matir bachardal. Rabbi Yossi, however, says you don't have to be worried about that. Again, Rabbi Yossi seems to be agreeing to the first two, because there, if you want to think about it conceptually, in the first two, there's a danger of what we call in Hebrew plisha. Plisha means going from your area into another person's area. You're kind of invading. There's an invasion. The water from the flax, machine, from the flax, the water from the from the soaking of the flax is going to invade and, seep into the yerek of the other person. On the other hand, and the same thing with the bitzalim, it may seep into the bitzalim, into the other person's. In the second situation, I'm not, so to speak, I'm not doing anything. I'm not harming the chardal. The dvorim are simply going themselves to eat the chardal, and they're getting themselves the problem. I didn't do anything wrong. I can plant in my chardal. If your dvorim, if your bees come in, okay, that's their problem. But then it goes further. Marchikim et ha'ilan min habor 25 ama. You have to make sure that your ilan, that your tree that you plant, has to be away from your neighbor's bor, your neighbor's cistern, 25 ama. Im habor kodam, and if the bor was there first, kotzeitz v'notein damim, you have to chop down the tree and pay him. The ima ilan kadam lo yakotz. But if the ilan was there, then you have first right. Safek ze kadam lo yakotz. If you're not sure, don't tear it down. Rabbi Yossi Omer. Rabbi Yossi says, no. Afal pi shehabor kadam et ha'ilan. Even if the cistern was there and built prior to the ilan being planted, lo yakotz, you have no obligation to chop it down. Ze chofer b'toch shalo, v'ze noter b'toch shalo. It's your space. A man's space is their castle. You can do whatever you want. Rabbi Yossi represents the first approach that I mentioned to you. Rabbi Yossi represents the kind of laissez-faire. Everybody in their own space can do whatever they want. If if for some reason something happened, okay, that's the cost of living next to each other, right? The fact is, if you live next to each other, you have to recognize that, right? It's like living, it's like when I lived in the city, and I would, and there were always, elderly people going down the subway, the steps, and you would always have one or two people who would get upset. You could see they were visibly upset because they wanted to rush and they wanted to get to the subway quickly. And I always thought to myself, first of all, one day you're going to be old, so you should recognize that and not be so pushy and try to get around the old lady. Number two, part of living in a society is that we recognize that there's old people and babies and strollers, and that's just the way it is. And so you just got to live with it. So Rabbi Yossi, in effect, says, this one digs his bore. He digs his cistern in his area, and this one plants his tree, and hopefully everybody's happy. But sometimes things don't work out perfectly, and that's okay. So again, these are two very different conceptions about how to work out living arrangements. And clearly, the thrust of the sugyot follows the Tanakama, which is that no, that that Hilchot Shchenim, so to speak, obligates us to work very hard to make sure that even if we're bishali, even if I'm doing what I want in my own space, I got to be cognizant of how it's going to impact on others. It's not by chance that, there's an echo in this Mishnah, which might have very negative connotations. And maybe that's the way the Mishnah represented Rabbi Yossi. But for those of us who remember a Mishnah much later, let me see if I can pull that up. If you remember a Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. So if we have the Mishnah, let's bring up Pirkei Avot. So the Mishnah says in Pirkei Avot, Arba midot ba'adam. There are four qualities. Ha'omer shali shali. If I say mine is mine and yours is yours, zu midat beinonit. This is average behavior. Your is yours and mine is mine. V'yeshomrim zu midat sdom. And some people say that's Sodom-like. Shali shali v'shalcha shalcha. Now this is talking about proper. It's not talking about property necessarily, or maybe it is talking about property, but it's talking about things. Here, when we come back to what I was talking about before, we come back and we, we're sharing the handout. We go back. Is there an echo at all? Is there any echo at all that the Mishnah, when Rabbi Yossi says, Rabbi Yossi Omer, Afal pi shaborka lo yakot ze chofer betoch shalo v'ze noter betoch shalo. It's a kind of shali shali v'shalcha shalcha, and wherever the chips may fall. Which again is Rabbi Yossi taking the view that that's a beinoni, that's a midah beinonit, and the Tanakama and the rest of the parak is really taking the view that that's not a proper approach, and it borders on midat Sodom being applied here, certainly in the context of Hilchot Shchenim. Maybe in the world of just strangers, you can say, Zeh shali v'zeh shali. It's mine, it's yours, and we don't have to, and whatever happens, happens. But maybe dafka in the world of shchenut, in the world of neighborly, when I have imposed obligations one to each other, the whole calculus changes. Okay, now let's analyze the second chapter in terms of a little bit more, in terms of language and structure. Because if you look, interestingly enough, you'll notice the structure of this parak, and it's highlighted here. First of all, it starts and ends in a similar place. Cases. Lo yachpor adam. Bor, it should be adam. Bor velo shiach velo me'ara. You're not supposed to dig a cistern, a hole, or a shiach. another kind of little canal and a cave, all these different things, unless Ella imkain hirchik mikotlo shel chavero shlosha tfachim. So the model with these in this first section, you notice lo ya'aseh x Ella imkain y. Lo ya'amid adam tanur b'toch habayit. A person should not set up an oven in the house. Ella imkain, except if you did this and this. Lo yiftach adam chanut shel nachtomim. You should not open a bakery in your house. Tachat otzaro shel chavero, underneath the storage area of your friend, because all of the heat and the humidity and all those things will weaken whatever is there, and maybe it'll even ruin whatever is staying there. So again, you have this lo ya'aseh x ella imkein asa y, lo yiftach is, etc., etc. And some of them, they're absolute. There's not ella, it's absolute. We end off the perek with the same language about hayach chofer bor shiach ume'ara. So we have a literary envelope in terms of the perek starting with that language about a cistern, about some sort of little channel or little area, a little cove, and then and you end with that. But I want to go a little bit further. You notice all of these have lo ya'aseh x, L-O-Y, lo ya'amid x, L-O-Y, lo yiftach adam x, L-O-Y. When we get to the second half of the perek, so basically Aleph through Dalid, the dominant language is lo ya'aseh x, L-O-Y, lo ya'aseh x, L-O-Y, lo ya'aseh x, L-O-Y, lo yismoch, lo ya'aseh x, ella imkain, etc., etc. When you get to Mishnah Hay, it starts with different language. It starts with marchikim, 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 marchikim. At the end, it goes back, and we'll talk about this last section, which probably is the beginning of a last section. But it's interesting that there's a kind of distinction. Even though the word marchikim appears a couple of times in the first section, and even though the word lo ya'aseh ella appears once or twice in the second section, the main body of language is lo ya'aseh x, L-O-Y, unless you Ela imkein here chik, unless you made sure to make. What's the difference? Now again, I mentioned this entire perek is about one general concept called harchakat nizikim, making sure not only that you pay for damages that you do, but that you're proactive to make sure that damage doesn't happen. Just parenthetically, what is the source of that principle? So I mentioned the source is the laws of shchinut, but it's interesting that some of the Rishonim actually attach an interesting pasuk to this, and that is, this is rooted in the fulfillment of the mitzvah taseh of ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, and you shall love your reacha, the sense of re'ut, which again, I want to just argue that maybe is highlighted and by the shchinut. The sense of living together, one by the other, creates sort of mutual obligations to each other. But what is the difference between the language of the lo yachpor, the first part of the perek, and the marchikim? And a number of people have noted that if you look carefully, basically the difference is what we would call, to a great extent, the merchav. The merchav. What area are we talking about? When you talk about a town, a village, a city, basically, just like today, today we also have other categories, but the basic distinction are what we would call residential areas versus commercial areas, right? Commercial versus residential. Today, we also have areas which are just for entertainment. We have theaters, but fundamentally, one area, one issue, or one space within a village, a town, especially in antiquity, is the space where people live. Now, in the space where people live, they have to do certain things. They have to prepare food. They have to grow vegetables. They have to wash their clothes. They have to bake their bread. Meaning, there are certain things that have to take place within what's called in Hebrew the merchav hamichya, the azor, the area of living. Then there's another category, is the area of commercial, where if you were planning a city or you were planning a village and you didn't just happen happenstandishly, you try to plan it in such a way that certain things are not next to where people live, right? In the olden days, the cemetery was on the outskirts of the town. Okay? You might put in Israel, right? At one point, they always used to put all the garages and all of the auto repair shops on the outskirts of the town. Where do you put, when you're doing tichnun, when you are setting up a city or a town, what would be the ideal place of urban planning? That's what we call it today, urban planning. Where would you put stuff? So you would assume you put stuff at the periphery of the city, not in the middle of where people are living. First of all, because it could be harmful to the people living, and also gets in the way. It's much more complicated to get to. You have to do this, you have to do that. There's not enough area to spread out. The first half of the perek is all about the merchav hamichya. It's the space where people are living. So here it talks about lo yachpor adam bor samuch leboro shel chavero v'lo shiach v'lo me'ara v'lo amat hamayim. You're setting up for kovsim. You're setting up for laundry. These are kind of basic needs of every household. You can only do it elim ken hirchik mikot lo shel chavero. Meaning these things have to be there. It's not like you have a choice. You must have somewhere to wash your clothes. You must have somewhere to bake your bread. You must have somewhere. So these things have to be there. But even if they have to be there, you have to do them in such a way that are at least as much as possible within the confines of close living quarters that don't lechatchila impinge on the other person's space. So here it says, marchikin hatazraim v'tamacharesha v'tmei haraglaim min hakotel shlosha tfachim. You have to make sure that the seeds that you plant and the macharesha, the digging that you do, and mei raglaim, the urine, if you have urinals, you have to do it min hakotel shlosha tfachim. It has to be at least removed from the wall that divides between one farm and another farm, at least 3 tfachim. Marchikim et harechaim shlosha min hashech. You have to make sure that the rechaim here refers not to commercial. It refers to every person had their little grind millstone, not millstone, little grinder at home. Today you go to the store, you buy bread. But in those days, you may have gotten a delivery of wheat that you bought, and then you grind it yourself, and you make it yourself. Like people today, they're very into grinding their own coffee or whatever. So they ground their own. This is all the grinder, the tanur. This is all within the house. And therefore, lo yamid tanur b'toch habayit, anken yesh lo gabav, etc., etc. This is all appropriate. Now, in passing, it mentions the language of marchikim. Now here, why does it use the language of marchikim here? It uses the language of marchikim here probably because these are things, or some of these things may refer to things which are not just personal use, but also commercial. And basically what the Mishnah is saying, that if you want to put something in a commercial space, you want to put something which has a kind of dual use. It has personal use, but it also has commercial use. And then you have to make sure that it's separate in this and this and way. By using the language of marchikim, you're basically identifying that these are things which are normally they take place in a kind of industrial zone, or they take place in an area which is set aside for public use. And you brought it into the chatzer. If you want to bring it into the chatzer, then you have to have a higher level of taking care of it. We now go to the second part, and now we're talking almost entirely about what we would call, so to speak, the more commercial things. Marchikim et hasulam min hashovach, the nests of chicks. The nests of chicks should be far away. Marchikim et hashovach min ha'ir 50 amah. They should be far away from the outskirts of the city. You should do all this and this. Marchikim et ha'ilan min ha'ir, the fruit trees which are growing, they should be on the outskirts of the city. Marchikim goren, the silos. The silos were not in the middle of Broadway. The silos were on the outskirts of the city. Remember the story of Ruth? It was far away and she went. And people sometimes would sleep there to protect it, whatever. Etc., etc. Marchikim et ha-nevelot, the nevelot, the non-kosher slaughtered animals, vetakvarot, and the cemeteries, vetaburski, the tanners, 50 amah min ha'ir, from the outskirts of the city. Again. All these things are things that you really are supposed to be doing outside of the city. So marchikim, you push them aside, marchikim et ha'ilan, min habor, etc., etc. The final unit here is, the final unit we come to is, of course, the unit about, and again, it's interesting because you could have put this unit, some of it in section 1 and some of it in section 2. But for some reason, the author, the editor of these mishnayot, decided to put all of the mishnayot which talk about ilan. This is what I would call chativat ha'ilan, the section that deals with trees, and did a mishmash. Everything here is about ilan. Marchikim et ha'ilan min habor 25 amah. Lo yita adam ilan samuch lisdei chavero, elim kein hirchik minu 4 amot. Ilan shehu notel letoch sedei chavero. If a tree overlooks and starts to, noted, starts to, so to speak, fall into kotzeitz melo mardel gabe hamachresha. So can you trim it? Can you not trim it? Ilan shu notel reshut harabim, and it ends off just like it. Here we're talking about an ilan that you've, so to speak, that is being done in the space of another person. It ends off talking about urban planning. So just like over here we talked about personal mostly, and here we talk about more urban planning mishnayot, and in all of them marchikim or lo ya'aseh, we end off ilan. Again, the last 4 mishnayot are all ilan. It's almost as if the ilanot have their own kind of Helfgot ilan, the laws of the ilanot. Ilan shunotel reshut harabim. If a tree starts to overhang into the public domain, kotzeitz kadei she'agamal over berochvo. You can cut it down. So if somebody's personal tree, the city is allowed to cut it down, because if it's getting in the way of people who are, coming on a camel, etc., etc., and again, some other laws. Okay, so that's chapter 2. Let's begin tonight, chapter 3. In chapter 3, which, as I said, chapter 3 is a very famous chapter. It's one of the chapters, if you yourself or you have children who've studied in yeshivot or midrashot, this is one of the classical prakim. This is one of the classical chapters that is always studied in the world of yeshivot. It's called Cheskat Batim, or in the yeshivish world, Cheskas Abatim. It's very popular parak to learn, and it deals with chazakot. Chazakot. The word chazakah is one of those words that means many different things in many different contexts. For example, chazakah sometimes means we have a statistical assumption based on statistics. We make an assumption based on statistics. For example, we might say, we cannot check every single strawberry that comes into the restaurant. So if I check, one pallet from 10 pallets here, and I don't find any bugs, I'll say it's bechezkat kashrut. It has a chazaka. I can assume that there's no more bugs because these strawberries probably don't have bugs because I checked them. Okay, that's a chazaka based on checking. Or I might say, a chazaka that I don't have to check the lungs of an animal because most kosher animals don't have diseased lungs. Statistically, we can, that's one kind of, that's not the chazaka we're talking about here. Chazakot that we're talking about in this parak is what's called, there's a few chazakot that are being discussed here. We are discussing cheskat re'iyah, cheskat kinyan, and cheskat tashmishin. Let me explain all three, and then we'll see how much time we have to finish, to go into at least one of them. Cheskat re'iyah, or ra'ayah is better translation. So let's start simple, right? Jewish law knows of basically two categories of stuff. One is called movables, which we call mitaltalin, a chair, a watch, a camera, a computer. These are things that I can hold in my hand and move an animal from one domain to another domain, from one ba'alut to another ba'alut, right? I transfer ownership by moving it from one reshut to another reshut, or by doing some sort of symbolic kinyan, but these are metaltalin. Or in another phrase in Aramaic, nichsi denaidi. These are assets that are able to be transferred. Metaltalin, money, cash, goods. Then there is a different category called nichse delo naidi, things that cannot move, okay? Property, land, things of that nature, which are not movables, okay? In some legal systems, they call that real property. Real property is something like land. Okay, when a person, okay, now let's say I own a car. Or let's put it this way. I have a car under my possession, okay? I have a nice, which I do, 2018 Toyota Sienna. This car was once owned by someone else, okay? I bought it in 2020. From 2018 to 2020, it was owned by Ruvain. Now, I bought this car in 2020, and I now have the car. And this is a car that's known. It was known to everybody in the town that at one time it was owned by Ruvain. And now Shimon is driving around the car. Ruvain comes and shows up at some point in 2022 and says, hey, Shimon never paid me for the car. It's not his car. It's my car. I am what's called in halacha the marakama. I am the original owner. And there is no documentation. got all lost during the pandemic. Everything got lost. Okay. And everybody knows there's witnesses that say that Ruvain owned the car. He bought the car new in 2018, and he definitely owned it till 2020. But Shimon says, I bought it from you. Does Ruvain have any claim at all? Does Shimon have to do anything? Does he have to take an oath? Does he have? And the answer is no. Because Hamotzi mechavero olav haraya. That's the famous principle. If you want to take something which is now in my possession, and you want to take it from me, you have to bring proofs. You have to bring witnesses that I never paid you. You have to show documents that show that I owe you money, whatever it is. That's the principle of Hamotzi Mecharer Olav Haraya. That is the halachic principle that obtains when it comes to metaltalin, to anything that's immovable. Okay, the very fact that I have it in my hand or I have it under my possession, that's all the chazaka that I need. That's called cheskat metaltalin. I own it. The chazaka, the assumption is, since it's under my control, it's mine, unless there's contrary evidence to it. What about when it comes to property? When it comes to property, I have a piece of land, which was known. It was known that this property was once the property of the Goldstein clan. And now the Helfgots are living on this land. They're living on it. They're tilling the soil. But everybody knows that at one time was the Goldsteins. And now the Goldsteins show up in court and they claim that this land is theirs and I never bought it fair and square. So, and there is no documentation. The shtar, the contract, has been lost. But he claims, Goldstein claims, it's his land. What's the halacha? So the halacha is that when it comes to many types of property, real property, land or things in land, basically, if a certain amount of time has passed and Helfgot has been living on the land and no one objected, we assume that the following happened. We assume that Helfgot did purchase this legally. And the fact is that since a certain amount of time has passed where Goldstein could have come and challenged Helfgot's control and brought a case to court, and Helfgot would have had to produce documents which prove that he bought it fair and square from Goldstein, because Goldstein was the original owner. But if a certain amount of time has passed, you cannot demand that Helfgot hold on to all this documentation, right? Like with taxes, right? Don't they say, accountants say you should hold on to your tax forms for 7 years. After 7 years, today everything's electronics, it doesn't matter. But after 7 years, you can get rid of it. And they don't have a taina on you. And then the IRS doesn't have a challenge to you because, look, you did what was expected. You kept it for the right amount of time. So too, if you come and taina that this land is yours, I can say I have a chazaka. And this is called chezkat gimel shanim. You look at the first Mishnah. First Mishnah says, chezkat batim, borot, shichim, ma'arot, merchatzaot, shochavot. All these, right, houses, cisterns, canals, all these things which are non-movables. Beit habadim, a house where you make, stuff. Beit hashlachim, avadim, v'chol shu oseh perot tadir. Anything that is perpetually making fruits. Chezkatan shalosh shanim umiyom liyom. Chezkat raya. You have to have been on that land for at least 3 years. After 3 years, if someone comes and challenges your ownership of the land, basically if you can prove that you were there 3 years, and everybody says, yeah, he's been there for 3 years, we know, and the owner didn't say anything during those 3 years, at this point, it is his. This is not a kinyan. He's not buying the land. The land was bought 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever. It was bought the whatever way you buy land. How do you buy land? That's the Mishnah and Kiddushin. The Mishnah and Kiddushin talks about kinyanim. How do you buy property? How do you buy slaves? How do you buy animals? The Mishnahs and Kiddushin talk about that. This is what's called cheskat raya. This is a chazaka. I have an assumption that this is mine, because otherwise someone would have challenged me. And if you didn't challenge me within 3 years, you can't expect me to hold on to the shtar, to the document, for more than 3 years. That's the first chazaka. The second category of chazaka in this is cheskat kinyan. How do you acquire land? How do you acquire land? And so it talks about how you acquire land. We'll get to that in passing. Then there's a thing called cheskas tashmishin. Cheskat tashmishin are not that you have a proof that you own this piece of land, but you have a chazaka, you have an assumption of the fact that you've been on this land and you can constantly do something. You don't claim this land is yours, but you claim that the owner has given you rights to use this land for this purpose, right? Let's say like two neighbors, and the kids always use the big backyard of the other neighbor to play football, play soccer, play basketball. It's a kind of mechila. The neighbor says, of course, it's great, let them play. And if this has been going on for a while, then at a certain point, it's a chazaka. It's an assumption that this person has allowed this without any protest. And we assume that he can continue to do this because the other person allowed him to do this. And there's no reason to stop him from doing this at all. Now, the question, of course, can become, can a person change their mind? Sometimes people can change their mind. Okay, we have to talk about this. The last part of the perek is kind of closes the circle where we come back to Hilchot Shchenim, and we'll get to that. Okay, so Im Yirtzeh Hashem next week, we will go into some detail about parts of Perek Gimel, and also touch on the new Chativa, the new section, which begins with Perek Dalid, which already is a new section which talks about mechira. How do you purchase a house? How do you purchase a boat? How do you purchase other things, etc., etc.? And we will go into that. Im Yirtzeh Hashem. I wish everybody a wonderful week, a great Shabbat again. Our thoughts are very much on what's going on in Israel constantly, both in the north and in the south. Very sad things that are going on, and we continue to pray and hope for peace and for certainly the protection of Am Yisrael and all the soldiers and anybody who's innocent that's caught in the crossfires. And hopefully we'll continue our learning in Yirtzeh Hashem next week. I wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom and see you next week.
Thank you, Rabbi Helfgot. Thank you to everyone who joined us. We do have a lot of exciting classes going on right now, so head over to drisha.org/classes to check those out. And everyone stay healthy and see you next week. Thank you for joining us.
Okay.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye.